open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, bless those Americans and their families, the people who've served our country in the military. Bless this food and the nourishment of our bodies and us to thy service. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. I'm going to remember that we asked for announcements at this time. It's unusual. John, you have an announcement.
Thank you. Our speaker next week is Paul King. You may remember Paul joined us in the midst of COVID and launched our AV efforts for not only men's breakfast, but for our weekly service in the sanctuary. And probably his biggest contribution to Trinity was introducing us to Emily Beaver. So he'll give us an update on what he's been doing.
I'd like to introduce one of our special guests. This is Jeff Gober, my oldest. He's a partner with John Oglesby at West Paces Advisors. Anybody else have a special guest? We have several.
I call my brother Alan, I call him the tall, handsome one. Stand up and prove it.
Welcome. Alan has an illegal guest.
I snuck my mother in today. Her name's Nancy Spetnagel. So please hold your witty remarks till after we're all gone. Thank you.
Charlie?
Yeah, I have my friend and neighbor, old business partner, Ed Croft here. Ed had family at Pearl Harbor, and he was very interested in hearing your stories, Leslie.
Welcome all our guests.
I got an announcement.
Does anybody else have an announcement?
Yeah, I do. It's Charlie.
Somebody, oh, on Zoom. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, I just want to congratulate you, Jim, and George Hopfier for your elder nomination.
I haven't been voted in yet.
Well, I feel pretty good about it.
Yeah. Well, I volunteered. I accepted the call. Thank you for that. I'll introduce our guest. I know her pretty well. Lastly, and I met at Duke, first date, January 7, 1971. And she graduated from Duke University with a degree in French literature and psychology. Then she has a connection with somebody else in our group here. She took she got a degree in Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Georgia State University. And she had a very special professor, one of her favorites, or her favorite there, that she'll tell us a little bit about. Her book is not a World War II history book. It's many things. And I can tell you that she worked at Westminster for 20 years, teaching literature and American studies. And for 10 years after that, she'd wake me up at 3 or 4 in the morning when she would get up to rewrite something she'd written the last night or the last week or years ago in her book. And we're still married because I have an incredible ability to go right back to sleep. So I'll let her tell us the rest about her book to the extent her voice is working this morning. Lastly.
A lot of husbands love it when their wife loses her voice. Tom and Hal Adams' sister, Dabney. Did any of y'all know Dabney Hart Adams? Adams Hart. She was fabulous. And we have that connection and a lot of other connections. We have neighborhood connections and everything. So, and Tom and Anita are reading the book together, which is really sweet. And every once in a while, he'll email me and say, now, he wasn't really, there's no such thing as a first lieutenant. But we had to talk about that because I don't know anything about that, but I did have to look up a lot. I think I'm just going to start. My voice is terrible, so if I start losing it totally, I might call on somebody from the audience to finish reading. And I'm going to start with a prologue to the book with a reading. And that little girl is I, and that's grammatically correct. And I was not a good go to bed at night child. And I always wanted to stay up and see what the grown-ups were doing. But I did have this question, what did you do in the war, Daddy? So in the late 1950s, a child asked her father a question that children all over the world were asking theirs. What did you do in the war, Daddy? That night, the father tucked his daughter under the covers among an assortment of dolls, stuffed animals, and little golden books, and in a whisper told her his war story for the first and final time. Well, they put me on a ship that carried me halfway around the world and dropped me off all alone on a tiny island in the middle of the ocean. Along came a great whale to swallow the island in the middle hole with me on it. There I was inside the belly of the whale, where it's dark and you don't know when or if you'll ever get out alive. After what seemed forever, the whale spit me out and the ship came to pick me up and take me home. The end. He didn't say that, I did. The end. Because that's the last time he ever talked about it. And it's not like I never asked, because all through my life, I was curious about war. Why do we have them? Why do we have so many? What is it about our humanity that we fight wars over things? And I was a teenager and a young woman during the Vietnam War in college, where every year when they do the draft call, we'd listen to it on the radio because we had boyfriends and brothers and who we'd see what their draft number was and how close they would come to being drafted. So, but he never talked about it again. So what I have in this book is, as Jim says, it's not just a World War II story. It's a story about a boy at war within a story, larger story of World War II. And because I had a horrific history education, no offense to anybody who taught history in this room, we went from war to war to war. That was history to our history teachers. But we never saw, how do you get into this war? What happens when it's over and you get out? And that's always one of the things that fascinated me. Why do we do it? What happens when we're there to real people, not just the heroes and the battles and all that? And so I was learning about the war in this process of reading these letters, because when my father never talked about it, when he died, I thought his war story went along with him, because he never even talked about it with my mother. But soon after I retired from teaching, I was up in the attic going through some things that my mother had moved to Atlanta when she came down. And I found this accordion folder that had, and it said war correspondence on it. And I opened it up and I found this sheaf of letters wrapped in a faded gray silk ribbon. And they were in my father's handwriting. And if you can see on the book, if you can see the pages on the book cover, those are actually pages from the letters I found that are now in this book. And so I transcribed them, so just in case there was a fire in the house, we wouldn't lose the story. And in the act of transcribing them, I thought, gosh, I wish he were here so I could talk to him about this. So he had died in 1992. This was 2014. So I decided to write him back from the 21st century. So here I am, a grandmother, writing to a boy at war who's 21 and 22 years old. And that's what this book is. But I'm giving him some information about what happens next. So part of the book is me talking to him about aftermath and what's happening. So I'm just going to, I just decided to use just one theme that runs through the book, what it's like for a boy going off at war. But this is a list. If you can recognize any of these words and names of films, of stories, of novels, of characters, of operations, which I always think is so funny that they call a battle an operation when there's no healing factor at all in it. But these are some of the things that are in the book, but I'm going to focus on this. A story of the boy who got swallowed up inside a whale of a war, and the man who got spit out after all was said and done. Though not really, because there's always more to a true war story. And I did learn so many more things about my father and about the war than I ever imagined doing this work. So once upon a time, in the beginning, on the left is my father balancing his younger brother. And he writes to his younger brother, whom he left at home, because he was about 15 years old, and he had two brothers in the Pacific. And he really missed his younger brother because they were very close, even though they were 5 years apart. So he writes to him, and it's sort of funny what he writes, because he talks to him like a father, lad, let me tell you about women. It's pretty funny. The recipient of most of the letters is my grandmother, his mother, dear mom. And she was a world-class worrier. And she thought, I'm going to lose my boys. And after the war, actually, my uncle, the younger brother, went to Korea. So all three of her sons went to war. And in the early 50s, after he came home from Korea, she had PTSD from being a mother of a son. And there's my dad on the right, standing on his ship. Okay, because I'm a literary person or literature major, I use a lot of poetry and novels and stories. This is one of my favorite quotes from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, a poem that he wrote about World War I, where the character goes through the landscape of World War I and just sees all the devastation. So it starts, Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images. And that's what this book is. That's what any history story is. It's a heap of broken images. And we get all these little pieces, and we kind of have to put things together for ourselves. But there's always more. So in the beginning, I was traveling through space and time, gathering stories across the vast landscape of a Second World War, wondering what is there to know. So my father starts out a young boy on a big adventure. And he writes to his mother, the water is near shore greener than this ink, without exaggeration. And as it goes seaward and deeper, it changes from light to dark green and almost suddenly into a brilliant display of bluish hues, only by streaks of penetrating sunlight. Here the porpoise and the flying fish play about our bow. The porpoise streak toward the ship, suddenly twist their huge brown bodies and leap through the white rushing water thrown up by our heaving bow. A blue flying fish breaks through the water surface and floats gracefully over the white caps for some 60 or 70 feet. And that's the kind of writer my dad was. He loved to write. He was an English major at Duke, and so was my mother, and they met there, and that's why I'm here today. But my grandmother, even when my father was a married man with 2 children, she was frantic about him and taking care of him. So I wrote this memory that I had, wrote this to him. Now I've joined the correspondence between you and your mother. 3 generations, a woman born of the Gilded Age in 1896, a boy on the verge of manhood in the middle of a Second World War, and a wide-eyed, innocent, graying child of the Vietnam era. Each of us living the questions of war, past, present, and future, preparing ourselves as best we can for what may come. This morning, that wild-eyed innocent of the 60s is in the kitchen making granola to share with 8 grandchildren. Do you or my grandmother even know what that is? Granola. On the other hand, somewhere out inside, I'm still that little girl on the Jersey shore, shoveling sand into a bucket, watching from the water's edge as my grandmother, wearing a wind-whipped bathing dress, frantically waves for you, her grown son and father of two, to come in, David, come back in. You've gone out too far, she's thinking. She cries, come back in. And I remember that, and I think of that, of her thinking that the whole time he was there at war, come home. And of course, how many of you have ever served? He said, I just want to go home. Do you? And that. Okay, so here we go into the story. Rainer Maria Rilke, we must assume our existence as broadly as we in any way can. Everything, even the unheard of, must be possible in it. That is at bottom the only courage that is demanded of us, to have courage for the most strange, the most singular, and the most inexplicable that we may encounter. And the book is full of inexplicable things, as any war story is, I'm sure. One of the things, he started out in New Orleans, and they were training to use their LST landing ship tank to beach it. And they would unload, their job was to open up this big jaw of a ship and unload tanks and trucks and material of war and people. And they were working in the Gulf of Mexico. And this is my little joke. Do I have to go back and revise the whole book and call it Gulf of America? So, another thing that I do in the book, because I needed to do this, is to see what happened in war over the time that my father was there. So I started, I call it Time Out for a Timeline, saying it to my father, because what does he know from inside that dark belly of the whale about what's going on all around outside, both on the Pacific front and the Western front? So I have this is just an example of the kinds of things that I talk about. And it is history, but every once in a while I make a little comment because I get angry at certain people, or I think that's really interesting or great. This is the ship, LST 705, and you can see how it opens up like the jaw of a whale and takes you in and then spits you out. So here's some of the things he starts talking about. He thinks once he gets into in the war itself, he says, I'd say seeing is believing. He says, Japs are living in the hills in the immediate vicinity, and special patrol parties are sent out to kill a few every day. We saw one of those patrol groups coming into the base with a few Japs today. All enemy supply routes have been wiped out, and the remaining Japs are being starved out. They see an American patrol and just give themselves up in order to get food. Sorry, that's a typo. It is a very grim sight, seeing those young chaps with carbines slung over their shoulders, ready to kill at sight. Whoops. Here's another, I'm reading from the book. Meanwhile, war advances at warp speed. How will you keep up with it all? Breaking news, this is me, out there at sea. In the interest of historical context, I'm gathering a few of the most astonishingly broken pieces of your war, both the weeds and the flowers, and arranging these in a timeline. So that's the way I was thinking about that. And let's see, I'm having a hard time finding my pages. Okay, here's another that he writes to his mother. Well, Hun, he calls his mother Hun, H-O-N, not U-N. I've been at this long enough. The day we've inwardly dreaded is soon coming, not so much for myself, but almost all for you and Dad. I have a hollow and bitter taste in my heart about it. A son's going off to fight a foolish war is just about the greatest pain parents can suffer. The uncertainties and doubts and fears that can't escape your heart must be terrifying. I am sorry that I have to be a part cause of them, yet there is nothing for me to do but face it. I have to have courage, but please share that courage with me. Mine is not much different from yours. Yours is harder to hold because it is unseen. I can realize more fully the dangers that I'm going to have to face because I can actually see them. You cannot. But even so, Mother and Dad, hold on. Nothing is going to happen, I am sure. But of course, he was not sure. And then things happen in his story. He writes to his mother a very brief note about the death of a classmate. Dear Mom, remember Johnny Meisner, that stocky blonde lad from the fraternity you met? He was killed in France recently, and it surely hurt to hear about it. God, this is all so useless. And then he goes directly to a question about the delivery of mail. How many of you have seen the Tyler Perry movie 6888? Where he writes about this women, women in the army who went and organized the mail so it could actually get delivered. This was on the Western Front. It's a really good storytelling film. I think Tyler Perry's good at that. It's not, it's not art, but it's really good. And so I wrote to my dad, Dear Dad, your first report of a friend lost in combat. Without breaking, you top off the paragraph with a non sequitur about the delivery of mail. Sobering, the news, a very short story, as if delivered by telegram, in which each letter cost something. He was killed in France recently. Johnny Meisner, stocky blonde lad, killed in France. Johnny Meisner, a real life friend of your youth, of your innocence. The lad meant something to you. God, you cry out from the dark belly of the whale. This is all so useless. What else is there to say? You don't talk about it. Only punctuate your response from another, more emphatic, useless. What more have you seen of war bringing you to this place? You know more than you're saying. Messaging death from telegram. My mother's friend, Mac Duncan, along with twins, Edward J. and Edwin J. Hensley. No further pursuit. Lost at sea. Incomplete sentences, terse language out of the blue. How the news falls like a single leaf from a massive tree covered with them. Once green leaves crackling and crumbling where they land. Will my parents remember them always, these friends of their youth, these casualties of war? Will their young faces visit your dreams as long as you both shall live in the silent reckoning with war? My mother, Tom thinks that Dabney might have known the twins from Asheville and Mac Duncan. Mac Duncan was a football player from Duke, and he named his plane, that was a B-24 bomber, the Iron Duke. And he and these two boys were on a flight over the English Channel, and they went down. There were some survivors, but the three bodies of the pilot and his two friends were never found. And so my mother wrote a letter to Mac Duncan's mother, and she wrote back. And I asked my mother, long after the fact of that event, what she remembered about him. And she said, well, we really were just friends. And we wrote letters back and forth. And one time he sent me a box of gardenias, and they were so sweet. So, these little moments that you don't get in a history book Um, and this is from Washington Irving, from Rip Van Winkle. There is a sacredness in tears. They are not a mark of weakness, but of power. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They are the messenger of overwhelming grief, of deep contrition, and of unspeakable love. And every time I'd ask my dad over the course of his life, and he died at 69 of emphysema, started smoking at war. I think a lot of people did. And I would ask him, Dad, tell me more about your war. And he had these sort of oceanic green-blue eyes, and they would just pool with tears, but they would never spill. And then he would look off into the distance and not take me with him. And I could tell he was going places that, you know, he would never let me go. So excuse me. Let's see. Christmas was a really tough time. And he writes about this on December 29th, 1944. Dear Mom, we've come quite a long way since my last letter, and there are a million things to say, so I'll say them. We left New Guinea on Christmas Eve day with little time to think of the meaning of that holiday. The day before, we took on troops and cargo for transportation to another island farther up the line, absolutely without caring skedaddles whether Christmas was near or not. We all put in a terrific December 23rd. Trying to get the Army to help us load was in itself a burden. We started loading at about 8 in the morning and didn't finish until about 5 that evening, and no one to help out. I think that has been the hardest day since I came in. Not enough the loading. I had to make berthing places and arrangements for over 700 troops. That was a mess. We only have bunks for some 100 troops. We had 50 officers aboard. The men who weren't given bunks had to make the best of it on top deck and on the tank deck. Naturally, it rained the first night and every night after. The men topside were mumbling and grumbling to beat all. I had the 12 to 4 midnight watch, and every so often one of the men would wake up and curse the ship, the Army, and the weather. It really was hell for all of them. There were just too many for comfort. And so that was one. And this Lino Cut, he made Christmas cards for our family every year, and a lot of them were about peace and goodwill, you know, that peace and goodwill to men. And this is one he did of the cross with the word peace, Pax, at the bottom. He did this in 1979. A lot of his cards were of the three wise men. And he was just fascinated by the three wise men. And I think that's sort of interesting. You know, I've never really thought about it until he was gone. That's one of those questions I would have loved to have asked him. You know, what is it about the three wise men that you depicted them in your art so often? This is one of the toughest pages. He's writing to his brother, who is also in the Pacific. And he has volunteered for a job. He was asked to be a commander of a small boat for a second wave, and it was like a D-Day kind of invasion. And if you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan, you remember the pictures of those faces of those men going in the first wave and what it looked like to them. And they'd cross themselves and they'd throw up on the deck and everything. And I think that's what it felt like. And again, when I saw that movie, before I saw these letters, I never imagined it. But Steven Spielberg pictured it for me. And I used that beginning of that film in my American Studies class when we talked about how to tell a true war story. And we'd show clips of different war movies. We started out with a documentary footage of the landing of D-Day. And then we would show the Steven Spielberg version. And of course, the documentary version was black and white. The film was trembling, and the filmmaker was way far away from the people, so you could not see the faces of the individuals. You just saw the bodies going down and the ships coming in, and it was just very gray. And then we'd show them the Steven Spielberg version and ask them how they saw the two in comparison, the reality and the recreation. And they all said, in living color with close-ups of the faces of these soldiers when they were going in, was so powerful for them when you compare it with the fact that it really did happen. It's not just an adventure movie. These things really happen. For young people, when I was teaching, they didn't really know much about it. They were 2 or 3 generations removed from World War II. And so it's fascinating. And then when we had the 9/11, a few of my students volunteered. Some of them went to military school, and luckily none of them were killed, but a lot of them were very damaged when they came out of the Iraq War. So he writes to his brother in preceding this event that he's going to go into. And this is on 7 February 1945. Dear Ted, this will be my last letter for a while, possibly my last ever. We're off again, and it's going to be the worst yet. They asked for volunteers for some special dirty work, and I was lucky or unlucky enough to get chosen. But what the hell? Somebody has to do it. And while it lasts, it will be fun and something different. I'd like to tell you about it, but that's impossible. You will read about it after it's over. And when you do, you can have whatever satisfaction there be of knowing that your kid brother was in there pitching. It's funny, but I don't feel the least bit afraid of what's ahead. A year ago, I probably would have shuddered just thinking about it. But for some reason, it doesn't even bother me now. Of course, I beg you not to tell Mother or anyone about it back home. By the way, I got a great letter from her. He's talking about my uncle's wife. I'm only telling you about this because I know you'll keep it under your hat. And if something happens, I know you'll explain the circumstances better than a telegram could. I'll enclose a letter in an envelope to be opened only if something fouls me up. I can trust you not to open it before then. And then he says, the last mail is going off in a few minutes. I must stop. Hope to hear from you soon. P.S. I haven't time to enclose that envelope. Just as well, though, I guess. Tell them goodbye for me if necessary. And we don't have the copy of that letter. So I wonder if he ever wrote it. This is another question I would have asked if you were here when I saw this. Did he write it? And if he did he just put it in his pocket? Did he tear it up and throw it into the water and let it sort of dissolve into the water? Or did he mail it? Or did he want to mail it and decided not to? I mean, there's all these questions. What did happen? So that's just a show of a pattern of this young boy on an adventure, so excited to go into war, to see what it's like, to go to all these new places. And there's some exotic tales from the South Pacific that he tells. I mean, weirdly exotic. So if you get a chance to read them. So towards another poem by T.S. Eliot, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, one of the things he says, it is impossible to say just what I mean. And I feel like that often, how do I say when I'm really thinking? It's so hard. Some of these things are so hard. So my father was an artist as well as a writer. And instead of telling us about his war, he painted these pictures. He was, after the war, he married my mother. He finished college and married Mom, and they came to New York. And he was working for McCann Erickson, and she was working for RCA with David Sarnoff at the RCA 30 Rock. And we just went there last weekend to see. At night, he went to the Art Students League and took art lessons. and he'd come home and he'd paint. And this is one that we found when we were going through all of his things, cleaning out the house, because my mom was going to move 2 years after he died. And we found this. It was rolled up. It's a watercolor, and we'd never seen it. He'd never had it framed. And so I was the one who got it. You know, we started distributing all this stuff. And I kept it for a while, but I didn't have it framed and I didn't hang it because it was just so weird. But then when I read the letters and I saw how this painting came out of some of the things that he wrote to his mother about shipping through an island, past an island that had volcanic eruptions and what that looked and felt like. All these different images, and somebody like Alan might be interested, the artists here, in talking about what you would see there. But I just had to interpret it for myself and ask him, you know, what did you mean by that, But the thing I was most fascinated about, do you see in the lower left-hand corner, the human hand, the green hand with the charred fingers? And I just want to know what that is. What did he have there? It looks like it's kind of pulling out from all this destruction and disaster to try to create life again. And then another one that I call Gunther. Actually, a friend of ours called it that. It turns out when I was doing my research, and I read in the New York Times an article about the Bois Brûlés in Europe, where this reporter was going and visiting this place, and they came across a memorial to the last to die in this operation in France. And I wrote about that boy, just imagining who he was and what it was like for his parents. You know, the war, I mean, that battle was essentially over, and he got shot and died. And there were several stories like that. But Gunther was his name. He was named Gunther. Well, prior to my reading that and finding that story, a friend of mine, people would come to our house all the time. And my dad did hang this prominently in the den. And people would come to our house and they go, what is that? What are you saying there? What does that face look like? It looks a little bit like Monk's The Scream. But if you can picture in your head Monk's The Scream, that figure is looking outward at what's coming toward him. This figure is looking at his hand. And my mother said she thinks he is contemplating the human hand, given the power to create or destroy. And that's a big theme of the story. You know, who are we as human beings? And what do we do in terms of creation and destruction? So this is my father. He was a fisherman, and he was in advertising, but he did a lot of fishing. And this is the last lines from The Wasteland. The character who's been going along the landscape says, I sat upon the shore fishing with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my lands in order? And I love that ending because he goes through all of this experience of war, all this landscape of destruction and death and horrific activities. And he comes out on the other side. And the last words of the poem are Shanti, 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 from the Upanishads, meaning peace that passeth all understanding. And that's why I wrote this book, because I would love for peace to be something that we all know instead of war. And so that's a little part of it. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody?
If you have questions, please use the microphone. Anybody?
I have a question. Did your dad's brothers make it through the war?
Yes. All brothers came home from war.
Did you hear any stories from them?
I don't have much about them, and I don't have the letters that they wrote to my father. They didn't save those. My grandmother, early in the correspondence, he asked my grandmother, Mom, please save these letters. My kids, if I ever have any, might want to read them. And then he never showed them to us. So something happened, you know, that he didn't want to bring it up. He didn't want to talk about it. So I found them, and I just feel like, what if our grandkids had found them, no offense, and found them and thought, what is this? This is, why do we need this? And they might have gotten rid of it. You know, you go through the attics of old people, like, and you think, we don't need this. But so that's the answer. We don't have some of the letters. We don't have the mothers my grandmother wrote to him. Yes.
Once father posted in France on Twitter, I think he was a popular speaker at book clubs, which are mainly lady things. Are you speaking at book clubs, groups that small?
Well, the book just came out about a month ago. And so I have, the reason I lost my voice is I made a presentation last night to a launch. It was a launch party that actually Robert and Larry's wives and a couple of other wives gave for us. And I talked at length with this group of women. And here I am today with men and Pink Nancy. I think that was so bold of her to wear pink today, I thought. And so I am going to do that. I would love to talk to book clubs.
And of course, you can get the book on Amazon. Can you
Yes.
get the book elsewhere?
You could go to Barnes and Noble and order. And
Oh.
I don't know if you know the store Erica Reed, which is a gift store, but Erica's a friend of mine, and it's over there on Roswell Road at Powers Ferry. And she has some books there.
Ooh.
And I also have, I should have brought some cards, but you could order it through the original. I have a website, LaslieFGober.org. So it can tell you how to order it. But
Thank you.
Charlie's guest served at Pearl Harbor. Is that correct? There's somebody here. Oh, okay, your uncle. So her uncle was also there. That the brother Ted that her dad Dave wrote to was at Pearl Harbor. So they were
he was
back and forth.
stationed, pretty much stationed there, as opposed to my father was moving all around.
Were they all in the Navy?
Yes. There was a love of the sea that they all had.
Hi, can you back it up to the picture that your dad drew? That one
That
more
one?
there,
Oh,
Gunther.
Gunther.
Now, I don't know if it's just me, but it's not like he's looking at his hand. It's got his hand in front of his mouth, trying to cover something, and he's trying to not speak when they come, not to be heard when they come into the house. So I don't think he's looking at his hand, or is that just me?
Well,
So it's like, trying to,
it could be the depth perception, because I think he's got it up here. And it's like when you go like this.
that's what I'm thinking, right? So
Yeah.
he's not looking at his hand.
Yeah.
He's actually not trying to let them hear him when
Right.
when the Germans come into the house. But that's just me. I don't know if I'm the only one.
Also, his eyes are looking down. So what is it? I mean, I don't know.
Well,
It's like
it looks like he's, Anne Frank in the attic looking down.
that
I don't
you
know.
Yeah.
That's just me.
No, I think it's great for people to have different perspectives. And I do think, we come to a painting, I think, with our own perspective of, what's happening. So, but that's what my mother thought. And I think even if he wasn't thinking that, that's the kind of thing he would have thought, because that was my dad. He was a creator. He was a writer. He was a advertising man, but used his writing and he was marketing a lot. And he was a painter. And so that was his way of expressing. Yeah.
I have a similar little different interpretation. Oh, is this what's become of me?
Yeah. And I will say this, and for those of you who have been in service, how many people would come home and tell the story about their killing someone, shooting to kill? Not many, I don't think. No. So you don't know. I don't know what whether he did. I will say he did see his ship shot down a kamikaze pilot. And my father was on the conning bridge and the plane came down right beside him, maybe where John Shepard's standing, maybe where Paul is, or even Nancy. And he could see the face of the Japanese boy, who's a boy just like him, who's been sent to war, crashing into the water and going into the graveyard of the sea.
Go ahead, Bill.
Leslie, I am absolutely blown away by what you've done.
Oh,
I'm stunned.
thank
And I'm not sure that, I guess everybody else probably feels that, but I really hadn't said that.
you.
But that's a 3-year journey that you've had, and it
And
culminated just so nicely and beautifully, and we got to get the word out somehow or other.
thank you.
I got involved with a book that was written by Frank Murphy on his travails when he was shot down on the Western Theater back in 1943. And I wrote 10 articles about that book that he wrote. And they came out in Masters of the Air, the movie and everything. But to have done what you have done and put it together so beautifully is it's stunning. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bill. And I will say that one of the lines that I've come away from this is you can talk to the dead and the dead will respond in memory. Because I really did have a 10-year, I still have a relationship with my father, though I lost him 33 years ago. So,
you're making all of us think, and I'm thinking about my father, who graduated from Georgia Tech in 1938, right before the war, was in Naval ROTC there, went to become an officer in the Navy, and then the war broke out. He was the child of a good Presbyterian mom over in DeKalb County, and he could not bring himself to go to war. He could not put himself in his moral conscience to be in position to kill someone or facilitate that. That said, of course, what was going on through Hitler, the Nazis, the Japanese was horrible, and a response was needed. And one of my great regrets is that I never really sat and talked to him about that dilemma and how he dealt with it. And I'm sure he struggled with it much later in life too, but he didn't write letters. I've curated everything from all my parents' papers, but I think I was chicken to ask him about that moral dilemma there, because there's no right answer.
and my father uses terms like useless war and foolish war, but I think he also knew that there were some really bad things that we were fighting against and fighting for. And they call that one the last just war, just as in justice, because it was horrific. And just as an aside, when I used to teach the play Shakespeare's Othello, I would ask the students after they'd met Iago, do you think he's the most horrific character you've ever met in life or in history or in a book? And they said, well, Hitler. Even young people know the story of Hitler, and it's interesting, he's not the biggest killer of people. Mao, I think, got top on the list, which is interesting. I learned all these things doing the research. Sort of the list. Stalin was horrific. There's so much humanity in these stories, and I really appreciate what you're saying, Bill, and Craig, what I really hope is that all of you have stories or you've talked to someone who has stories, and that you'll talk to each other. Because sometimes you'll be surprised. I mean, when I've told people that I've been doing this, they start telling me their stories. And it's amazing how they get enlivened by, thinking, oh, my father was there, or, my mother. I mean, there are some that had mothers. And you start adding up all these stories of people. We don't get those. We get the battles. We get the number of dead. We get the names of the ships and there's a big long thing I wrote about the USS Indianapolis, which was very late in the war. And the way I found out about it first time was in the movie Jaws, when Quint is telling them the story, and then of course he slides down into the mouth of the great white, and he was playing a survivor of the Indianapolis, telling that story. But then I read the real story, and I'm not going to tell you because spoiler alert, but in my book, I go through the story of the captain and what happened to him after the fact. And it's really fascinating. Tim, did you?
Leslie, a question and an observation. One, my father was in Europe, and same time, the same story almost exactly, except as far as never wanting to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, where are your dad's paintings now? Are they hanging in your house?
You know what? My brother, when we distribute, my parents had this great theory of how to distribute the best stuff, my father's art. He had 4 major paintings, and we played a game of Trivial Pursuit. And the winner of the 4 of us, the winner got to pick first, and then the second, place. And I wanted this at first, even though it's kind of scary. But my brother wanted it more. I knew it. So I picked one that was an abstract called Jazz is a River. And I love it. I'm kind of glad I have that now. This one is in my brother's house. So when I found this and I started looking at it again when I was writing the book and thinking about what it's saying and what he's expressing in this painting, having read some of the imagery in the book that seems to go with this, this is his speaking. And so I thought my brother deserved to have it because it goes with Gunther. And so I sent it to him during COVID.
Good for you.
Last, when you had your prologue and you talked about what your dad said he did during the war, and you talked about the whale, I thought that was a metaphor for the war, but it was for his ship.
I think it was a brilliant metaphor. When I was a kid, he told me that, and I believed it, literally. I thought, wow. So of course, I went to the kindergarten playground, and I started telling all my friends. And then some older kids said, that didn't happen. So it made me start thinking. I still believed it, but it sort of made me start thinking. And at some point, I figured out, I'd seen him in a bathing suit, and I didn't see any teeth marks or anything. So it couldn't happen. And so I disbelieved it. And I thought he lied to me. And my father was not a liar, but he lied to me. But then as I got older and I started understanding the meaning of metaphor, I started thinking it was a perfect metaphor. You get swallowed up in this big thing, and it's dark in there. It's so dark in there. And you don't know when and if you're ever going to get out. And then you get spit out, if you're lucky, and the ship comes and picks you up and takes you back home. So it's a beautiful metaphor. And then the ship looks like a whale. I mean, it opens the big jaw and stuff goes in and stuff comes out.
So
lastly, this is George Parson on Zoom. I've enjoyed your talk so much, and I had an opportunity to talk some with my dad. I wish I'd had more of my dad talks with my dad, but the amazing experiences our dads went through, nothing could compare. I've thought often in my life to those experiences. My dad got 1 year in at VPI. He had a brilliant mathematical brain, and they took him and sent him to Kansas, putting people into the war. Then he eventually went to France and fought in France. And then when he came back, they sent him to New York to discharge people. And so people would be across the desk from him and he would discharge them. All this experience. And then his supervisor in New York said to Dad, I know you want to go back to college. I know you need to make arrangements. When you're ready to go back to college, discharge yourself. Just finish the paperwork, put them in that day's paperwork, and put them on my desk. So we arranged a trip back south to Southside, Virginia, and then arranged to be going back up to Blacksburg, and walked in and discharged himself by putting the paperwork into the inbox of his supervisor. And that was the end.
Wow. There's all kinds of stories.
So Leslie, I've never been to war, but I just have a couple of thoughts. I'm a professional artist, and I think both those works of your family member perfectly express what he's talking about, because art is all about metaphor, and it's all about the things in between the words that you have no words for. And I think that I've wondered why veterans don't want to talk with anyone about their war. And I think part of the answer is they can't talk about it except with another veteran who's been there, because there are no words for this. And we have words for feelings, happiness, sadness, guilt, rage, but there's millions of words we're lacking for lots of feelings that are admixtures of lots of words, feelings that we have words for. So they can't talk with anyone. They know that they can't talk with them. The person's not going to get it. So the art, I think, is just tremendously important. And I think what you've created is an artwork. It's a new art form. And so I hope that you do talk with these smaller groups and that other people will kind of follow this model, if you will, to get at some of the interstices of the truth. And then maybe people can stitch those together, and that will have an impact about our enthusiasm or need for war. So very well done, very deeply impressive. Thank you.
And I really do believe that history should be a story and a collection of stories, and that young people need to hear stories like this and history. I mean, I'm really worried that we've lost history. Somebody was talking the other day about faded memory, that we have forgotten even some of the recent past. And what about the young people? I mean, I taught high school for 20 years, and they were some really bright kids. A couple of them parents of a lot of kids are parents of my former students at Trinity. And I want that for them. I want young people to know these stories of, yes, we never had to sacrifice. But there people have. They still are. Policemen are sacrificing, firemen. We just were at the 9/11 memorial, and you see all the names on the pool, and those are people. Those are real human beings, and I think when we give somebody a name and even a face or a story, it's so powerful. It becomes real, and it's something that we can identify with. And it's not that we should feel guilt about what happened in the past, but we should feel, what do we think about who we are now and where we want to go from here? So that's kind of my goal. Anyway, thank you.
Robert, I think we have maybe one more question.
Leslie, did you ever, or do you have any thoughts about what the big operation was that your dad was going into? Any ideas what that may have been? What invasion of a particular island or something, presumably? But
He was in charge of the ship log. And so I have his handwritten log and where they were at different times. And it's hard to tell, I mean, because he's so vague about it. But it was around in the Philippines and So there was a lot going on in the Philippines, Leyte and Zamboanga and all these places I'd never even heard of. And he also asked his mother for a map. Please send me a map so I can mark where I've been. And that was another thing he never shared with us. You know, but I did have the log. So, and one last thing, and I know it's time to go. Towards the end, I talk about the bomb. And he did write letters after because he wanted to go home. When the bomb dropped and the Japanese surrendered, you think, oh, it's over, we can go home now. Well, no. He had to stay in until April of 46. And he had to transport Chinese refugees and Japanese prisoners of war home before they could go home. And his letter, and those letters are not in this book, but they are very bitter. I mean, there's a bitterness to them that's even more so than this. They were so ready to go home. Intellectually, he knew that that was unrealistic, but emotionally, he just couldn't take it anymore. So he would have, if we hadn't done the bomb, they were training all this time for an amphibious landing. And, you know, we could all of us think about what would have happened if we'd done that instead of what we did. I also talk a lot about Oppenheimer. I have a lot of strong feelings for him as a person and what he went through. So thank you all so much.